Chapter 1. The teardrop on the prayer beach. Soft clang of crystal against china echoed faintly. Across the high-ceilinged ballroom of the Moncrief estate, a sprawling Gothic manor nestled in the Berkshire countryside. Rain pressed gently against the diamond-paned windows, catching the flicker of candlelight as if trying to listen in on the gathering inside. It was the final night of the Moncrief Family Trust's annual Benefactors Weekend, an event known equally for its lavish display of antique relics and its stifling atmosphere of obligation and old money pride. By 10 o'clock, the air had grown dense with perfume and politeness. Guests clustered around miniature exhibitions in various rooms, the famed Eastern reliquary cabinet in the East Parlor, the disputed Aramaic manuscripts in the library, and most notably, the Moncrief Rosary, a 13th-century string of carved jet prayer beads, said to have once belonged to a penitent queen, Lady Beatrice Moncrief. The aging matriarch with pale, hawkish features stood near the display case containing the rosary. The beads rested on deep plum velvet, their lacquered sheen interrupted only by a single teardrop-shaped stain, a clear smudge, just beneath the sixth bead. It had not been there the day before. Condensation? Asked Mr. Halifax, the family solicitor, adjusting his spectacles and leaning in with professional skepticism. No, whispered Lady Beatrice. Her lips trembled slightly. Someone has been inside the case. In the corner, a younger woman stiffened. Alice Gray, the estate's archivist and newest hire, was the one who had last catalogued the beads. She clutched a folded linen handkerchief between her gloved fingers, and her eyes, gray and unsettled, flicked from Lady Beatrice to the small stain on the velvet. She did not speak, but something in her silence rang louder than words. The sudden chime of the great hall clock struck 10:30. It was then that the scream came. High-pitched, trembling, and unmistakably male, guests rushed toward the west corridor, where the door to the chapel had been left ajar. The scent of wax and dust mingled with the iron tang of something darker inside. Beneath the carved wooden crucifix, a man lay collapsed at the foot of the altar steps. His tailored dinner jacket was crumpled, his right hand outstretched toward a loose scattering of rosary beads that trailed from the prayer cushion toward the chancel rail. The beads ended in a jagged break. The man was Dr. Percival Ashenden, noted archaeologist, public skeptic of the Moncrief Reliquary Collection, and keynote speaker for the Benefactors Weekend. A pool of blood, oddly small but vivid, had soaked into the embroidered cushion beneath him. A woman leaned against the wall, ashen-faced. Eleanor Moncrief, the widowed niece of Lady Beatrice, pressed her fingers to her lips. Her rosary, a modest replica of the family heirloom, swung lightly from her wrist. She murmured, he was just reading the Latin on the arch. I left him for a moment. Alice Gray stood at the threshold of the chapel, still silent. She now held the linen handkerchief tightly in one hand. It was no longer clean. Her other hand, unnoticed by the crowd, trembled slightly as it brushed the edge of her skirt. Someone called for the police. Someone else closed the door, but the mystery had already taken root. Lady Beatrice turned slowly toward her solicitor. You must wire Monsieur Poirot, she said. Immediately, Halifax blinked. The Belgian detective? If anyone can make sense of this. She looked back toward the chapel, her face unreadable. It is he. Across the ballroom, the guests whispered behind champagne flutes and half-lowered fans. Whispers of scandal, of the cursed beads, of old secrets best left buried. And beneath the surface of it all, the teardrop, inexplicably resting upon the sacred relic. A tear that had no owner, a stain that should not have been, and a murder that would unravel more than history. Chapter 2. The beads are counted. Following morning brought a hush over Moncrief estate, as if the house itself had absorbed the shock of death and was reluctant to exhale. Fog clung to the trees outside, veiling the stone pots and pale, shifting curtains. Within the drawing room, the murmurs of grief had been replaced by brittle civility. Lady Beatrice Moncrief presided at the head of the long table in the breakfast room, her pale hands wrapped around a cup of dark, untouched tea. She had not changed from her morning black, though no formal mourning had yet been declared. Her eyes did not leave the window. As Inspector Cowles from Berkshire Constabulary read from his notepad, with the dry exactitude of a man used to routine tragedy, Dr. Percival Ashenden was found just before 10:30 p.m. According to multiple witnesses, the inspector said, eyes flicking up now and then to gauge reaction. He was lying at the foot of the chapel steps, near the kneeling bench. The immediate cause of death appears to be a puncture wound to the side of the neck, likely inflicted by a small, sharp object. There were no defensive wounds, no sign of a struggle. At the far end of the table, Eleanor Moncrief sat wrapped in a shawl despite the August warmth. Her eyes were ringed with exhaustion, and her tea had long gone cold. She flinched slightly when the inspector mentioned the wound and the rosary beads. Lady Beatrice asked, still not turning from the window. Scattered. Cowles replied, the string was severed. Most of the beads are accounted for, though a few remain missing. He paused. Not the historic ones, of course. These appear to be from a replica devotional string someone carried on their person. All eyes briefly shifted to Eleanor, whose own rosary had not been seen since the night before. Cowles cleared his throat. I've requested an official forensic team from Reading, but Lady Moncrief insisted on another line of inquiry. He turned slightly as a new figure stepped quietly into the room. It was Hercule Poirot, compact in stature, elegant in dress, and utterly composed. He entered as if he already knew the nature of every heart in the room. His mustaches sleek, symmetrical, and entirely impossible twitched slightly as he surveyed the table. Mesdames, messieurs, he said, with a polite nod, I thank you for your patience. I come at the request of Lady Moncrief, who is, I believe, correct in her instinct that this crime is no ordinary thing. Alice Gray, seated closest to the door, tensed. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on Poirot with something between fear and fascination. Poirot turned to Inspector Cowles with a gracious nod. You have been most diligent, monsieur. May I ask, the key to the chapel, was it secure? It was stored in the west corridor cabinet, as always, Cowles said. Kept under glass. No sign of forced entry. So the killer likely had access, Poirot murmured, stepping toward the sideboard and running a finger lightly along the polished wood. And the victim Dr. Ashenden was last seen speaking with? Eleanor's voice, brittle and soft, answered him. With me. We were discussing the inscription above the altar. It's a quotation from the Book of Job. Poirot turned, his eyes resting gently on her face. And then you left him alone? She nodded. I went to fetch a Latin translation to confirm a word. I was gone no more than 10 minutes. Poirot bowed his head slightly. Merci. May I ask, was Dr. Ashenden known to have any enemies? Halifax, the solicitor, cleared his throat. He was, shall we say, a controversial figure. He accused Lady Moncrief more than once of falsifying provenance documents for the reliquary. His keynote speech was expected to be pointed, a speech he never gave, Poirot said, softly. And yet he came to the chapel to kneel. No. Eleanor's brow furrowed. Yes, that's what struck me. He seemed reverent. Oddly so. Poirot tapped his fingertips together, then turned toward Alice Gray. Mademoiselle, you were the last person to handle the Moncrief rosary, I believe? Alice stiffened. I inspected it for the exhibition, catalogued the original, but I didn't. No. I do not accuse, Poirot said gently, his voice like balm. But tell me, did you notice anything unusual before the Teardrop appeared? Her eyes flickered. Not at first, but later that evening. I noticed a single bead was darker than the others, only slightly. I thought it might have been a trick of the lacquer. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Darker, you say? Curious. Cowles shifted, clearly impatient. If I may, Monsieur Poirot, are we not overcomplicating this? The victim was an outspoken critic of the collection. Miss Grey worked closely with him on past exhibitions. Lady Eleanor was seen with him moments before death. All three had motive or at least proximity. Poirot's eyes twinkled faintly. And yet, mon cher Inspector, proximity is not proof, and motive is not guilt. Besides, we have not yet heard from the fourth shadow in this tableau. Fourth? Lady Beatrice asked quietly. Yes, Poirot said. The man who was conspicuously absent from the drawing room last night. The Reverend Paul Lincoln, the family chaplain. I understand he has long opposed the public display of the Moncrief rosary. Lady Beatrice's lips thinned. He finds such things blasphemous. We've had disagreements. Poirot turned to Cowles. Might I request the Reverend's presence at once? Cowles nodded. I'll see to it. Poirot walked slowly toward the window, standing just beside Lady Beatrice. Madam, he said softly, when you saw the teardrop, did it strike you as familiar? Or did it feel symbolic? Lady Beatrice's face did not move. Her gaze was fixed on the gray grounds beyond. It was not a teardrop, Monsieur Poirot, she said after a pause. It was a warning. Poirot gave a small bow. Then we must listen very carefully to what it was meant to warn us of. As the house braced itself for the hours to come, the teardrop remained burned into the minds of those gathered, and somewhere in the estate, a killer quiet, calculating, and possibly weeping waited. Chapter 3. The man who prayed without belief. It was just past 11 when the Reverend Paul Lincoln entered the study where Poirot, Inspector Cowles, and Lady Beatrice had reconvened. The room, once used for generations of Moncrief patriarchs to compose letters of diplomacy or judgment, now bore the quiet tension of accusation. The Reverend cut an imposing figure in his cassock, tall, stern-faced, with iron-gray hair and a voice steeped in patience and authority. But there was a hollowness in his eyes, as though the world had long since worn through something vital within him. Monsieur Poirot, he said with a mild nod. Inspector. Lady Beatrice. He declined a seat and remained standing near the tall-backed chair, reserved for guests. A shaft of sunlight broke through the window and caught the silver crucifix pinned at his chest, casting a glint onto the oak paneling behind him. You did not attend the gathering this morning, Cowles said, not bothering to hide his irritation. I was in prayer, Lincoln replied, calm. For the soul of Dr. Ashenden. Poirot, seated neatly beside a side table, folded his hands. It is most admirable, monsieur, to offer prayer for the dead, especially one who challenged the very core of your vocation. I bear no malice toward the deceased, Lincoln replied quietly, though I disagreed with his academic theatricality. I did not wish him harm, yet your absence at the hour of his death is curious, Poirot said delicately. Where were you between 10 and half past on the night of the murder? Lincoln's eyes flicked downward, then returned. I was in my quarters, writing in my journal, alone. Cowles scribbled something. And no one saw you? No. Poirot gestured slightly with one hand, his voice gentle. You were aware, I assume, that the rosary was to be displayed publicly. I voiced my objections. Yes, Lincoln said. An item of sacred use should not be reduced to spectacle. I've told Lady Beatrice as much. And Dr. Ashenden shared your disapproval, though for different reasons, Poirot noted. Yet he went to the chapel. To pray, it seems. Or perhaps, to examine something. The Reverend's jaw clenched. The man mocked faith in every publication he wrote. Still, he died kneeling, Poirot said softly, and the beads, those he never believed in, were scattered around him like broken pennants. A silence fell, and Cowles shifted impatiently. Lady Beatrice, who had remained seated in contemplative silence, finally spoke. "You forget, gentlemen, Paul is family, not by blood, but by decades of loyalty. He buried my husband. He christened Eleanor's son. He has heard our confessions." Lincom's expression did not change, but a shadow crossed his face. "And I will continue to serve, madam, if I am permitted." Poirot stood. "You are devoted, reverend, but even the devoted sometimes act from desperation, and I must consider all possibilities." Lincom inclined his head slightly. "Of course." Poirot turned to Cowles. "May I see the chapel again?" The inspector nodded. "It's been sealed, but we can permit access now." Poirot turned to Lady Beatrice. "Would you object to Miss Grey joining us? There is something about her silence that troubles me, though I do not yet know why." Lady Beatrice gave the barest nod. "She has the keys to the reliquary cabinet." The chapel smelled of cedar oil and stone dust. The red velvet kneeling cushion had been removed, leaving a paler square on the floor. Light filtered through the stained glass, casting fractured saints across the altar steps. Poirot moved with delicate precision, noting the angle of the broken beads. Some trailed in a straight line toward the altar, others scattered as if in haste. He knelt carefully, his fingers hovering just above the cold flagstone. Alice Grey lingered by the doorway, arms wrapped tightly around herself. "You are not Catholic, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked without looking up. "No," she answered. "Anglican. Then what do you make of this gesture? Ashton kneeling here, before a crucifix?" Alice hesitated. "Guilt, maybe. Or curiosity. Or he was trying to prove something to himself." Poirot looked up at her. "You knew him well, did you not?" "I worked with him years ago," she said, "on a cataloging project in Florence. We drifted apart, but you were close once." Alice's silence was its own confession. Poirot stood, brushing dust from his knees. "You left academia afterward. Why?" Alice turned her face toward the stained glass window. "Because Dr. Ashenden published a paper under his name that included my research. He credited me in the footnotes. Nothing more." "Ah," Poirot said. "A small betrayal, perhaps, but the small ones wound the deepest." Cowles, who had been examining the carved inscription above the altar, muttered, "All these people, harboring grudges. You'd think they lived in a novel." Poirot smiled faintly. "Life, monsieur, is often more melodramatic than fiction." As they turned to leave, Poirot paused at the threshold. His eye caught something half hidden in the crack between the floorboards and the base of the chapel wall. He bent and retrieved it. A tiny, almost imperceptible length of dark thread, stiffened at one end with a glint of resin. He held it up in the light. "Not from the victim's coat," he said aloud, "and not ecclesiastical." He placed it delicately into his notebook and closed the cover. As they exited the chapel, the bell in the estate's tower gave a single, solemn chime. Poirot walked just ahead of the others, his thoughts clicking into place, bead by bead. And though he did not yet see the full string, he felt a tightening tugging toward some final knot of truth, a teardrop, a prayer, and something hiding just beyond the veil of faith. Chapter 4. Poirot takes his measure. Be early afternoon. A hush had fallen over Moncrief estate, once again not the hush of reverence or grief, but the slow, tightening silence of people beginning to watch one another. In the drawing room, Poirot stood before a long glass case where the Moncrief rosary had once been proudly displayed. The beads had been removed to the vault for further examination, but the velvet remained, a plum-colored shroud, creased now where the teardrop stain had darkened it. He regarded the empty space as if the beads were still there. His reflection looked back at him faintly in the glass orderly, precise, inscrutable dot behind him. Footsteps approached with measured softness. "Mr. Poirot?" He turned. Alice Grey lingered in the doorway, Her fingers curled around the edge of the frame. "I've catalogued the bead sequence from the night before," she said. 26 beads, including the cruciform terminal. It should have been 27. One is missing. Poirot nodded slowly. The teardrop-shaped stain appeared beneath the 6th bead, did it not? She stepped further into the room. "Yes." Poirot motioned to a nearby chair. "Come, mademoiselle. Sit. It is easier to speak when one is not bracing oneself against the world." She hesitated, then obeyed. Her hair was tucked tightly behind her ears. Her eyes remained unreadable. "Tell me," Poirot began gently, "do you think the rosary was altered before the murder, or after?" Alice glanced toward the empty display case. "The stain wasn't there during the morning tour. I cleaned the case myself that afternoon. If the mark appeared that evening, it had to be placed deliberately." "You are certain?" "I am meticulous," she said simply. "Dr. Ashenden used to mock me for it." Poirot allowed a brief smile. "Ah, but we who notice the smallest things, sometimes we are the only ones who see the truth." A pause followed. "I didn't kill him. Monsieur Poirot, I did not say that you did. But you think I know more than I've admitted." "Yes." Her hands clenched faintly. "It's not fear. It's shame." Poirot leaned forward. "Then speak it aloud. Let us cast light upon it." She looked away. "I sent him a note. Dr. Ashenden?" She nodded. "I'd heard he was coming to the estate. I thought maybe we could speak. Privately, just once. About Florence. About what he took. What I lost." Poirot folded his hands. "And did you meet?" "I found the chapel empty that afternoon and left the note tucked into the missal. He must have read it before dinner. But he never responded. At least," she paused, not with words. Poirot frowned slightly. "You think the visit to the chapel, his kneeling, was a reply?" She gave a small, sad laugh. "A silent performance. An apology without admission. He was always theatrical that way. And the missing bead. I don't know," she whispered. "I wish I did." Poirot stood and moved toward the fireplace, where a stack of older estate ledgers sat untouched. "We must look beyond the crime, Mademoiselle Garay," he said, "to the stories behind it, the resentments that have settled like dust on these old stones." She stood, gathering herself. "I'll bring you the donor records." Dr. Ashenden was particularly interested in them before his speech. As she exited, Poirot's eyes narrowed. From the hallway came a different rhythm, heels, firm and deliberate. Lady Eleanor entered, her shawl replaced by a crisp silk blouse and black skirt. Her posture was poised, but her eyes held a storm she was trying, with great dignity, to conceal. "You asked to see me?" she said. Poirot gestured toward the same chair Alice had vacated. "Merci, madam. A moment of your time, if you please." She sat, folding her hands in her lap. "You were fond of Dr. Ashenden?" "I admired him," she said. "But fond, I think that is a stretch. You were with him shortly before his death. I told you I went to fetch a Latin translation. When I returned, he was gone. I assumed he had returned to his room." Poirot tilted his head. "Yet you followed him to the chapel?" A flicker. I had a feeling that something was wrong. Or perhaps it was guilt. I had warned him not to antagonize Lady Beatrice." Poirot nodded. "You spoke of the inscription above the altar job, was it not? 'Wherefore is light given to him that is in misery,'" she quoted softly. "And life unto the bitter in soul." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "You remember it precisely. I've known that verse since I was 16. It was my father's favorite." "Ah," Poirot said. "And did Dr. Ashenden know that as well?" She looked up, and her silence was an answer. Poirot walked slowly toward the sideboard, then turned. "Forgive the personal question, madam, but you wear no wedding band. Your late husband, was he also a man of faith?" Her voice became taut. "No, he died angry and drunk, and very far from this house. Then you came home." "Yes," she said, rising. "I came back to find peace. But peace doesn't live here, Monsieur Poirot. It only haunts." She left without waiting to be dismissed. Poirot remained still for a moment longer, watching the door after her. Then he walked to the case again and placed his fingertips on the velvet where the beads had rested. One bead missing, a tear that did not dry, a chapel kneeler soaked in blood, and a prayer offered too late. He murmured to himself, "This case, it is like the rosary. It is not about one moment. It is about the sequence. What came before? What leads to the next?" He turned and rang for tea. There was still a string to follow, and Hercule Poirot intended to count every bead. Chapter 5. The bead that never wasted. Afternoon grew older, and the house shifted with it, its silence not passive, but watchful, as if each doorframe and tapestry were straining to overhear. Poirot, ever methodical, returned to his temporary quarters and upstairs study hastily cleared for his use. The room was modest, but the wide desk afforded him space enough to range what he now thought of as his rosary of facts, a dozen notes laid out like beads, each connected by invisible string, on the left side. He placed what was known, the time of death, between 10:15 and 10:30 p.m., the position of the body, kneeling at the chapel rail, the fatal wound, small, precise, to the neck, the scattered prayer beads severed, but only one bead missing, on the right side. He laid out the shadows, the mysterious teardrop-shaped stain on the reliquary velvet, the note Alice claimed to have left in the chapel. Eleanor's familiarity with the verse from Job 1 Ashenden had quoted aloud just before he died, and, perhaps most curiously, the thread Poirot had found wedged beneath the chapel's floorboards, rough, waxy, not ecclesiastical. There came a soft knock, and Trez, he called. It was Halifax, the family solicitor. His expression bore the tightness of a man who dislikes surprises, particularly when the surprise wears patent leather shoes and solves murders. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the chair across the desk. "But of course." Halifax sat and cleared his throat. "I've been instructed to provide you with access to the estate's internal donation records. Lady Beatrice believes you may find something of use." Poirot steepled his fingers. "Ah, Trisbeen, you believe otherwise?" The solicitor shifted. "It's a generous interpretation of dusty files and benefactor gossip, but the Moncriefs have always been protective of their relics. Too protective, in my view." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Protective because of value or because of what might be discovered?" Halifax gave a guarded smile. "That depends on which Moncrief you ask." "Then I ask you." Halifax leaned back. Dr. Ashenden believed some items in the Moncrief collection were forgeries, or worse, modern objects passed off as medieval to increase prestige. The rosary was his chief suspicion, because of inconsistencies, because the sixth bead, the one beneath which the stain appeared, was of a different density than the others. So he claimed, at least. Poirot tilted his head. "And this difference he only recently discovered it." Halifax hesitated. He claimed he'd known for some time, but he waited until this weekend to announce it. Timing, perhaps. Or revenge. Poirot asked softly. They had history. He and Lady Beatrice. Poirot nodded slowly. And so the prayer beads meant to symbolize repentance became a battlefield. There was another knock. This time, Alice Gray entered, carrying two leather-bound ledgers and a folder thick with yellowing correspondence. "These are the donor records from the past decade," she said. "There's also a set of letters Dr. Ashenden had requested to review. They belong to a Benedictine collector. He once attempted to verify the rosary's origin." Poirot received the documents, as if accepting a sacred text. "You are most efficient, mademoiselle." Alice turned to leave, but paused. "Monsieur Poirot, if one bead is missing, but the rosary is still strung, could it be that the missing bead was never part of the original? Poirot glanced up, intrigued. You mean to say the string was built to appear whole but was never complete? She nodded. If someone substituted a bead long ago and it came loose, that might explain the density discrepancy. Poirot stood and paced slowly. And if that bead, the false bead, was planted deliberately or held a hidden message? Alice's breath caught. You think the bead was meant to be found? Poirot paused by the window, the afternoon sun barely slicing through the curtain. Perhaps, but it was not found by me. It was taken. That is what concerns me. A silence lingered between them. At last, Poirot asked, Tell me, did Dr. Ashenden mention the sixth bead in his note to you? Alice shook her head. No, just that he wanted to speak alone. Poirot tapped the desk. He never responded to you directly, but perhaps he responded symbolically. He knelt, he prayed, and perhaps he placed the false bead beneath the sixth. Alice's voice dropped to a whisper. But why? That, Poirot said, is what we must discover. By late afternoon, Poirot returned to the chapel. The space had not changed, but he now moved within it with fresh eyes. He went to the carved missal stand and examined its corners. Beneath the spine of the open prayer book, he found a faint crease on the page, too slight for anyone but the obsessive to notice. A note was here, he whispered, folded once, small, and taken. He moved to the altar rail and slowly ran his hand along its edge. Then he knelt, not to pray, but to understand. The perspective shifted everything. From this angle, one could see the tear-shaped stain on the velvet platform at a precise line of sight, meaning whoever knelt at the rosary display would see it immediately. But from above, from a standing position, it would have gone unnoticed. Poirot rose with care. At that moment, Eleanor entered, her face pale. There's something you should see, she said. In my room. Her chambers were modest, tucked away on the west wing. She led Poirot inside and pointed toward her writing desk. Laid carefully on the blotter was her personal rosary, the replica she'd worn around her wrist the night of the murder. Its beads were intact, save for one gap. I found it like this morning, she whispered. It wasn't broken yesterday. Poirot's gaze sharpened. And the missing bead? I don't know. I've searched everywhere. But, she hesitated. But, Poirot prompted. It was shaped like a teardrop. Poirot stared at her, the storm in her eyes finally breaking into a tremor. Madam, he said gently, why did you not say this earlier? She looked away. Because I wasn't sure it was mine. The one in the display case. I thought perhaps. Poirot stepped back. Then we must ask the final question, Madame Moncrief, he said quietly. Not where the missing bead has gone, but which rosary ever truly owned it. As he left her room, his steps were swift and precise, somewhere between faith and forgery, between love and retribution. A single bead had fallen, and someone had killed to keep it lost. Chapter 6. A bead de perfectivening had settled over Moncrief estate, like a veil drawn slowly across a mirror, muting, darkening, quieting. The estate staff moved with choreographed discretion, and the guests still remaining in the house now spoke in softened tones. Somewhere in the West Garden, a string quartet rehearsed for a recital that would never come. Their music, delicate and unsure, drifted in through open windows, giving the halls a ghostly soundtrack. In the drawing room, Poirot sat at a small side table, polishing his already gleaming silver cigarette case with a linen cloth. Though he had no intention of smoking, it was a habit one he reserved for moments when thinking required silence. Inspector Cowles stood near the mantelpiece, arms folded, irritation rising. We're chasing rosary beads, Poirot, as if they were emeralds. Poirot glanced up. Non, mon ami. We are not chasing rosary beads. We are chasing the story that the rosary tells. A story of deception, of guilt, of symbols turned into weapons. Cowles scowled. You think someone killed over a bead? I think someone killed over what the bead proved. Cowles stepped toward the table. So tell me, what have you deduced? Because I see a victim with many enemies, a chapel full of hearsay, and a stain that might as well have come from a child's wet thumb. Poirot gently set the cloth down. Then allow me to offer clarity. He stood, small and composed as ever. Dr. Ashenden died kneeling. Why? He was not a man of faith, so he was posing. That much we agree upon. Cowles nodded. Go on. And yet, if it was all a performance, why do it alone? Who was the audience? Cowles blinked. You're saying someone was meant to find him. Poirot lifted a finger. Not just find him, interpret him. The victim was staging a message, one he never got to finish. There came a knock at the drawing room door. A maid entered, pale and hesitant. Pardon me. Sir, Mr. Lincoln, Reverend Lincoln, he's requested to speak with you privately. Poirot raised his brows. Send him in. Moments later, the clergyman appeared, again in his formal cassock. But something in his posture had changed. He was no longer the solemn guardian of Moncrief's spirituality. He was a man pressed to the edges of silence. Thank you for seeing me, he said softly. Poirot gestured for him to sit. You come, I think, with a conscience newly awakened? Lincoln sat, hands clasped tightly in his lap. I didn't kill him. Poirot inclined his head. But I might have driven him to it. Or driven someone else to believe he had to be silenced. Cowles shifted. This had better be more than pious riddles, Reverend. Lincoln looked up. 4 nights ago, I confronted Ashenden. In the old library, he'd been reviewing provenance documents, the ones related to the rosary's donation. I asked him why he couldn't let it rest. Poirot's eyes flickered. And what did he say? Lincoln's voice tightened. He said it was all theater, that the Moncriefs needed faith like the stage needed lighting to create the illusion of grandeur. He claimed the rosary was a composite, half original, half invention, and that he had proof. Poirot leaned forward. What proof? I don't know. He wouldn't show me. He said he'd save it for the benefactor gala. A dramatic reveal. Poirot murmured. Lincomb nodded. I warned him. Told him this house would not survive another scandal. That Lady Beatrice's reputation, her entire life, was built on that reliquary. Poirot said nothing. I told him he was playing with fire. Lincoln finished, and he only smiled. Poirot placed a hand over his mouth for a moment, then removed it. You knew about the missing bead? Lincoln's eyes widened. No. But I saw a different string of prayer beads in the sacristy yesterday morning. I assumed they were Eleanor's. Poirot turned. Were they? I thought so. But one bead stood out. Slightly darker, almost waxy. Poirot's voice dropped. And did you take it? Lincoln looked horrified. No, I left them there. But when I passed by again, that afternoon they were gone. Poirot and Cowles exchanged a glance. Merci, Reverend, Poirot said at last. That will be all for now. As Lincoln exited, Cowles muttered. So now we've got a bead that moves from Eleanor's wrist to the sacristy, then disappears. Poirot's voice was quiet. No, mon ami. We have 2 strands, the heirloom rosary and Eleanor's replica, but only one missing bead. And whichever strand it came from, it must match its companions. Or not. Cowles stared. You think the missing bead was a plant? That it didn't match either rosary? Poirot folded his arms behind his back. That is what we must determine, an hour later. Poirot stood once again, with Alice Gray in the estate vault, deep beneath the house. The relics were kept in custom cabinets, lead-lined, humidity-controlled. The Moncrief rosary had been reassembled on white satin for forensic examination. 26 beads, each labeled, mapped, and tested for density and age. Do you see? Poirot whispered. Alice peered closer. Bead 6. Yes, it was subtly different. Slightly more lustered, subtly egg-shaped rather than round. To perfect, Poirot tapped the glass gently. A forgery within the hole. He turned to Alice. Could you reproduce one of these beads if asked? Carve it from resin or lacquer? I suppose I could. But it would take days. What if you were simply instructed to find one, a matching piece, and insert it where something had once been lost? Alice looked at him sharply. You think I... Poirot lifted a hand. None, but someone else might. He studied her carefully. Tell me, mademoiselle, did Dr. Ashenden ever question your work directly? Doubt your records? Discredit your scholarship? Alice nodded slowly. Only once. Years ago. He accused me of mislabeling a reliquary fragment. Publicly. And yet, here you are, archivist at the estate where his career would meet its end. She frowned. Are you accusing me of revenge? Poirot smiled faintly. No, mademoiselle. I am observing that everyone here is tangled in history. He turned toward the vault door. And somewhere in this house, he added quietly, is a bead that does not belong. A perfect bead. A bead that bears the weight of a lie. As the door closed behind them, the air seemed heavier. The rosary symbol of confession had become an instrument of concealment, and the soul who placed the bead there had done so not to pray, but to deceive. Chapter 7. A game of devotion. The next morning dawned sullen and damp, a haze of cloud lingering low over the Berkshire hills. The grass on the Moncrief lawns glistened with dew that would not dry, and the windows of the manor fogged at their edges, as though the house itself had exhaled and could not take the breath back in. Hercule Poirot, however, was more awake than the sun, already dressed and polished. He had requested tea, not coffee, and sat alone in the conservatory with a clear view of the chapel spire, its pointed cross faintly silhouetted in the gray light. He was not watching it for beauty. He was waiting for something or someone to betray themselves. His instincts told him that the game had already begun, not the crude game of crime and cover-up, but a more insidious one, the psychological game. The shifting of glances at breakfast, the hesitations in tone, the evasions masquerading as grief. He had seen such posturing before, the moment when the guiltless begin to doubt their own innocence, and the guilty hide in the folds of shared suspicion. Now, it was time to apply pressure. A small twist here, a nudge there, and the surface, so delicately composed, might crack. He did not have to wait long. Eleanor Moncrief entered the conservatory with quiet steps, dressed in a forest green blouse. Her eyes slightly puffy, but no longer wet. She carried a small tray tea for him, and a folded letter tucked beneath the saucer. When she set it down before him, she gave no explanation. She simply said, "It was slipped under my door during the night." Poirot studied her carefully. "You did not read it?" She shook her head. "Of course I read it. I just didn't understand it." He removed the letter and unfolded it with great care. The note was written in slanted, almost calligraphic script. Its contents were sparse. Confession wears many robes, some made of silk, others of ash. The sixth bead was mine. The guilt is not. Do not speak of Florence. There was no signature, no time stamp, no evidence of where the ink had dried. Only that strange line, "Do not speak of Florence." Poirot tapped his finger along the edge. "Miss Gray," he murmured, mostly to himself. Eleanor blinked. "You think it was from Alice?" "I do not think," Poirot replied, folding the letter again. "I listen. And this," he held it up, "this is not guilt. It is performance. A plea wrapped in mystery." Eleanor sat opposite him now, gripping her teacup with both hands. "Then who is it from?" "That," Poirot said, "depends on who knew what happened in Florence." Eleanor was silent a moment. "Dr. Ashenden and Alice Gray." She looked up. "And me." Poirot's eyebrows lifted. "I went to Florence years ago," she said, her voice low. "Not on official family business. Not with anyone's knowledge. I went to meet Percival Ashenden. Not for research, 4. Something else. Poirot's expression did not change, but he stilled, as though absorbing a gust of wind only he could feel. We had an affair, she said, too tired to hide it anymore. Brief, catastrophic. He promised me honesty, and I gave him everything: letters, translations, access to family papers. And he used it. His career rose, mine fell. Not publicly, just privately, quietly. The kind of damage no one sees until you're already ruined. Poirot let the silence settle like dust before he spoke. And Alice? She found out. I don't know how. She never said a word. But she left Florence a week later. And I never saw her again until this weekend. Poirot folded his hands together. So, 3 people in Florence. 1 humiliation. 2 betrayals. And now 1 death. Eleanor looked haunted. You think someone killed for what happened back then? I think someone never healed. And the crime of the past, mademoiselle, is often more deadly than the one of the present. There was a sound behind them, soft but sharp. A porcelain clink, like a teacup set down with too much care. Poirot turned his head. Alice Gray stood just beyond the archway, frozen. Her hands were empty, but her face was pale. I wasn't eavesdropping, she said quickly. I was bringing the forensic report you requested. She stepped forward, holding out a slim folder. The chemical analysis of the velvet stain and bead residue came in this morning. Poirot took it gently and nodded his thanks. You were in Florence, Eleanor said suddenly. Her voice cold. Alice did not look at her. Yes, you knew. Yes. Why didn't you say anything? Alice's voice was quiet but unwavering. Because I didn't know who to protect. And by the time I might have spoken, it was already too late. Poirot interrupted before the room could tip into emotional collapse. Ladies, please. May I suggest we all pause and consider what truly matters? He opened the forensic report, skimming quickly. Then he stopped. A single line had caught his eye. He said. Voila, what is it? Alice asked. Poirot held up the page. The residue on the 6th bead does not match the wood of the others, nor is it from resin or jet. It is wax-based, sealing wax, to be precise. Eleanor looked confused. So the bead was made of wax? No, Poirot replied. The bead was covered in wax, to appear sealed, to hide something beneath. Alice took a breath. A message. Poirot smiled. Perhaps, or perhaps something even more damning. At that moment, a bell rang in the hall. Not the church bell, the estate's front door chime. Inspector Cowles's voice soon followed, low but brisk, summoning Poirot to the east study. Poirot stood. If you will excuse me, mesdames, as he crossed the threshold. He glanced once back toward the 2 women, one seated, one standing, one hollowed by memory, the other stiff with secrets. The bead had been tampered with, disguised in wax. A false confession had been delivered under cover of night. And still, the prayer continued bead by bead, betrayal by betrayal toward a truth someone was desperately trying to keep sealed. But Poirot, the master of unsealing what others had buried, had begun to see the final shape of the string. And it was not a circle of peace. It was a noose. Chapter 8. A prayer interrupted. East study smelled faintly of sandalwood and ink, its shelves lined with ledgers and theological treatises. Their leather bindings faded into the same quiet brown. It was not a room of comfort, but of order, a place for deliberation, contracts, and secrets scribbled beneath official seals. When Poirot entered, Inspector Cowles was already standing by the hearth, holding a thin parcel wrapped in brown paper and twine. His expression was a curious blend of suspicion and reluctant interest, the look of a man who thought he had seen everything, but continued to be surprised by the eccentric threads Poirot tugged. It arrived by private courier. Cowles said, no return address, no signature, hand-delivered to the gatehouse. They claimed it was part of the benefactor archives, but I've never seen it before. The staff says it wasn't logged. Poirot examined the parcel carefully. The paper was aged and stiff, the twine knotted with delicate precision. He turned it over twice, then lifted the flap with the corner of his nail, unfolding it layer by layer until a small wooden box emerged hinged, lined in velvet. No larger than a prayer book. It had a faint engraving on the lid, a cross between two lilies, stylized in a distinctly Florentine style. A reliquary case, Poirot murmured. 19th century, if I am not mistaken. Decorative, not sacred. He unlatched it gently. Inside, resting on a square of cream satin, lay a single jet-black rosary bead. Not spherical, but elliptical teardrop-shaped. Along one side, the wax seal had cracked, exposing what lay beneath, a piece of rolled parchment. Impossibly small, barely thicker than a hair. Poirot's breath caught. The missing bead, he whispered. Or rather, the one planted to look like it. Cowles stepped closer. That was inside that? Hidden in plain sight. A message. Or a trap. With great care, Poirot removed the tiny parchment and placed it on the desk. Using tweezers from a nearby drawer, he slowly unrolled it. The script was cramped, but elegant Latin, inked in an almost ceremonial hand. What does it say? Cowles asked. Poirot read slowly, translating aloud. He who prays in falsehood makes a reliquary of lies. The 6th bead marks the penitent. Cowles blinked. That sounds like a warning, indeed, and deliberately so. A line meant to mimic scripture, but not taken from it. Then who wrote it? Poirot tapped the box. Whoever wanted to destroy Dr. Ashendon's credibility while appearing devout, or perhaps to signal that he had discovered the forgery and had to be stopped. Before exposing it, Cowles frowned. But if this bead was delivered today after his death, then someone is still manipulating the scene. Poirot nodded slowly. A second act, mon ami. The killer is not merely silencing the truth, but shaping its memory. As he spoke, the door opened once more. Halifax, the solicitor, stepped inside without knocking. He looked rattled, his usual composure cracked. I apologize for the intrusion, he said quickly, but you need to see this. From beneath his arm, he pulled a folder marked with the Moncrief seal. These are copies of Ashendon's private notes. I retrieved them from his guest room before the police sealed it. I hadn't read them until this morning. He laid the pages out on the desk. Poirot leafed through them, each sheet filled with annotations, diagrams of bead composition, comparison sketches. But then he stopped. A letter, unsent, dated 3 days prior. It was addressed to Alice Gray. Poirot read in silence, his eyes narrowing. The letter was both apology and confession. Ashendon had discovered that the 6th bead was not original to the Moncrief rosary. But it wasn't simply a replacement. Its insertion had been deliberate, tied to a series of manipulated documents that altered the rosary's provenance. To place it at the heart of a historical fiction, he suspected the forgery had been initiated decades ago, perhaps even by the late Lord Moncrief, and maintained over time by quiet hands. Ashendon had intended to reveal this during his keynote, not to embarrass, but to unmask the illusion. The last line was more personal. I was wrong in Florence. I see that now. I stole more than your work. I stole your peace. I will give it back. The truth belongs to you. Poirot set the page down, his fingers pressed together tightly. Cowles exhaled. So he was trying to make amends, and someone couldn't allow it. Poirot stood abruptly. We must act quickly. Why? Because this is not the work of someone improvising. It is a performance, and the curtain is about to fall. An hour later, the household was summoned to the gallery, the long hall that overlooked the southern gardens, lined with ancestral portraits and a grandfather clock that had ticked through 3 generations of pride and scandal. Lady Beatrice was already there, seated at the far end, regal and unreadable in a steel gray dress. Eleanor stood beside a window, arms folded tightly. Alice, pale and resolute, remained near the door. Lincoln arrived last, slipping in like smoke, his gaze lingering on the portrait of Lord Moncrief above the fireplace. Poirot addressed them all. "The sixth bead has been found," he said, "inside a reliquary case delivered anonymously this morning. Within it was a message, one wrapped in wax and scripture, designed to confuse, to appear sacred, and to obscure the truth." A ripple of tension passed through the room. Poirot paced slowly. Dr. Ashenden did not die merely because he was disliked. He died because he uncovered something woven deeply into the legacy of this house, a lie dressed as faith. He turned to Lady Beatrice. "Madam, did you know that the sixth bead was a forgery?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I suspected. For years. But I told myself it didn't matter. The story was more powerful than the fact." Poirot nodded solemnly. "But for one man, it did matter, and he planned to tell the world." He then faced Eleanor. "You lost something in Florence, something more than affection." She looked away. "Dignity." Poirot stepped toward Alice. "And you, Mademoiselle Gray, lost recognition, a future, perhaps even justice. But you did not lose your integrity. You came here not to retaliate, but to watch, to see what the truth would cost." Alice said nothing, but her eyes filled, and she blinked them dry. Poirot's gaze swept the room. "But only one among you feared the truth enough to kill for it, to seal a bead in wax, to compose scripture, to misdirect suspicion toward Florence." He stepped toward the one person who had remained quiet. "Even now, the Reverend Lincoln, you, monsieur," Poirot said softly, "you who understood the power of relics, who knew how to stage a confession, who believed that faith must never be sullied by scandal even if it meant taking a life." Lincoln did not deny it. He looked at the rosary bead Poirot held in his gloved hand, and then at the portraits on the wall. "I didn't want to kill him," he said, "but I couldn't allow him to tear it down. Not after all I'd helped them build." Poirot nodded. "A reliquary of lies, indeed." As Cowles stepped forward to make the arrest, Poirot bowed his head. The sixth bead had been counted. The prayer, at last, had ended. Chapter 9. The quiet that followed the gallery had emptied. The portraits, once passive observers, now watched over silence. Only Poirot remained, his small figure framed by the fading afternoon light filtering through tall mullioned windows. The wind outside had begun to rise, brushing the ivy-clad walls of Moncrief Estate with a restlessness that mirrored the undercurrent, still lingering in the air. In the quiet aftermath of Lincoln's confession, the house itself seemed unsure whether to exhale or recoil. It had been built on reverence rituals, heirlooms, names carved into stone, and now one of its oldest defenders had been unmasked as a murderer. Even justice, it seemed, did not arrive without leaving a bruise. Poirot sat once more in the east study, staring into the remains of a fire that had long since collapsed into glowing embers. His expression was unreadable, but his posture lacked its usual rigidity. There was a sadness in his stillness, not the sadness of loss, but of recognition. He had seen too many like Lincoln men who killed not out of hatred, but from the belief that they were preserving something sacred. In some ways, those were the most dangerous of all, because they believed, deeply, utterly, that their sins were sanctified by their cause. The door opened gently behind him. Alice Gray entered, not quietly, not boldly, but with a kind of calm steadiness that Poirot immediately noted. She was changed not just from the events, but from the release of truth. Her silence, once a shield, now felt like space rather than suppression. She carried nothing but a small envelope, which she extended toward Poirot without speaking. He accepted it with a nod and opened it delicately. Inside was a folded page from an old catalog, browned at the edges. A notation in the margin written in Ashenden's hand circled the sixth bead. In an old inventory drawing, The inked note reads simply, "Not original. Crafted later. Ask Alice if she remembers the artisan mark should be on underside." Poirot looked up. "You kept this?" "I found it the morning after the murder," she said. "I'd gone to his room to see if he'd left any private documents. I meant to give it to you right away, but I hesitated. I thought it might implicate me, or bring everything back. Florence, the humiliation. And now," Poirot asked gently, "now I think it belongs where it was always meant to be. Part of the record, not buried." He smiled faintly. "You are wise, mademoiselle. Records, like rosaries, only mean something when their beads are kept in order." She gave a soft laugh, half choked, half genuine, and stepped back. "Lady Beatrice wants to see you." In the chapel, Poirot stood. "Then let us pay one more visit to the altar." The chapel had been reopened, though it remained dim, the sconces burning low along the walls. Lady Beatrice stood at the altar rail, not kneeling, not praying, but simply standing, her spine rigid, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the very image of a woman confronting what could not be undone. When she heard Poirot approach, she turned only slightly, her voice low. "I always thought Paul would outlive us all. He was made of stone. Even stone," Poirot said softly, "may fracture under strain." She nodded. Slowly, "He wanted to protect the house, but in doing so, he stained it more than Ashendon ever could have. Percival was vain, yes, but he wasn't wrong." Poirot walked to the edge of the altar rail and looked down at the cushion where Ashendon had died. The bloodstains had been scrubbed, but the faint shadow of them lingered. "Truth," he said, "is not always kind, but neither is silence." Lady Beatrice turned toward him fully now. Her expression had softened, the sharpness in her features dulling with exhaustion. "Will the estate's reputation survive?" He considered this, then shrugged gently. "Perhaps not unchanged. But sometimes, madam, survival requires transformation, not preservation." She nodded once, then approached the altar and placed a single object upon the cushion. A rosary, Eleanor's, whole again, restrung. A new bead in place of the one that had been lost. It was slightly lighter than the others, but beautiful nonetheless. "I asked Alice to repair it," she said, "not to hide what happened, but to remind us that the string continues." Poirot looked at the rosary, then at the woman who had, for so long, ruled the house not just with control, but with silence. There was dignity in her now, not the kind inherited through title, but the kind forged through reckoning. "And Eleanor?" he asked. "She's staying," Lady Beatrice said. "For now. She and Alice have more to speak about. Things long overdue." Poirot inclined his head. "Then perhaps something good may yet come from something so bitter." As they stood together in the dim light of the chapel, the wind outside died down at last. The ivy stopped its restless tapping against the stained glass. Somewhere in the distance, the estate bell chimed once, a low, single note, like a breath released. Poirot stepped away, glancing once more at the rosary on the cushion. A string of devotion, a circle of repetition, a loop that had been broken by truth and mended not by denial, but by choice. The crime was solved, the killer named, but the house still carried its weight, as they always did, and Poirot, as ever, walked back into the long corridor of memory, leaving behind the quiet that followed prayer interrupted. Chapter 10. The Last Confession. The air within Moncrief Estate had taken on a strange texture. In the days following Reverend Lincom's arrest, it was not quite relief, nor was it mourning. It was something suspended, like the final echo after a bell has rung, when silence hasn't quite settled, but sound has already begun to fade. Servants resumed their quiet work, their steps measured and cautious, their eyes no longer darting down hallways as if afraid of what might be seen. Eleanor remained in the west wing, often seated at the window, her hands clasped around a closed book rather than rosary beads. And Alice Gray continued her meticulous archiving, though Poirot noticed she now worked with the lamp slightly dimmer, as if some private burden had at last been lifted from her shoulders. Poirot himself took refuge in the library, where the scent of old paper comforted him more than most human voices. Yet he had not departed. Not quite, not yet. There remained a final weight, a small but persistent stone in his shoe, and unease that the resolution, while complete in logic, had not fully resolved in heart. Lincom's guilt was beyond doubt, his means and motive clearly laid out, and yet there had been something to smooth about it all, something that did not scratch. That morning, as he arranged his travel case with careful precision, a second envelope arrived, hand-delivered by Halifax, the solicitor, whose face bore the hollow look of a man still grieving the stain upon a house he had long served. This was left at the rectory, Halifax said, addressed to you. He offered no further words and left as silently as he had come. Poirot opened the envelope carefully. It contained a handwritten letter, penned in Lincom's own distinct script. It was dated the night before his confession, written, it seemed, in full knowledge of what was to come. Monsieur Poirot, I imagine by the time you read this, my role in the affair will have been uncovered, and I shall no longer walk the grounds of Moncrief with my cassock unburdened. I do not write to beg forgiveness, nor do I seek to recast myself as a man misunderstood. I acted, I chose, and I will face what comes. But I must confess one thing further, not a denial, but a truth that I withheld not out of deception, but dread. It was not I who crafted the wax bead. It was already in place when I found Ashenden in the chapel. I recognized the scent of sealing wax only because I had once used it myself to preserve broken prayer beads years ago. But that particular bead, its precision, its weight, I did not carve it. I did not place it. I only feared what it meant, that someone else, perhaps even someone I loved as family, had already begun the game long before I chose to end it. If you must think less of me, so be it. But know this, I acted not to protect faith, but to bury shame, mine and perhaps others. I will not name names, for naming is another kind of violence. You, with your little gray cells, must do what conscience commands. P. Lincom. Poirot read the letter 3 times. Each time it altered in tone. At first, a final confession, then a surrender, and at last, a clue disguised as absolution. He sat very still. Then he stood. By late afternoon, the estate was once again gathered, not formally, not ceremonially, but as though drawn by a force of quiet inevitability. Lady Beatrice was in the drawing-room, seated beside the fireplace, her cane resting across her lap. Eleanor sat nearby, her posture guarded. Alice hovered near the cabinet of artifacts, her eyes no longer darting, but not entirely calm either. Poirot entered, holding the letter. Ladies, he said gently, I have come with one final truth, not about murder, but about motive, about what led to it. Beatrice nodded, as if she had expected this. Lincom confessed. What more is there? Poirot raised a finger. He confessed to the act, but he did not craft the wax-sealed bead. He found it already in place. The words fell like stones into still water. Alice's expression flickered first, not with guilt, but with grief. Eleanor turned her face away. Poirot walked to the cabinet and placed the letter atop it. The wax bead, he said, was a message, a beautifully subtle message, one that required patience, precision, and the knowledge of how to draw attention without speaking. It was never meant to provoke death. It was meant to provoke memory. He turned slowly toward Alice. It was you. Alice did not deny it. She did not shrink. She only nodded once. Yes, Beatrice inhaled sharply. Eleanor said nothing. Alice stepped forward, her voice steady. I found the false bead in a drawer of Ashenden's tools after I arrived. It wasn't wax then, it was unfinished. Just shaped wood, lighter than the rest. I realized what it was meant for, what he was planning. You sealed it in wax yourself, Poirot said, so that it would match the others, then slipped it into the rosary display. I wanted him to see it, Alice said quietly. I wanted him to realize that someone else knew, that his secrets weren't his alone to manipulate. It wasn't a threat. It was a mirror. Poirot looked at her with something softer than judgment. But someone else saw the mirror too, Lincoln, and he thought it was a weapon. Alice nodded slowly, and it became one. Beatrice closed her eyes for a long moment. Why didn't you say this before? Because I didn't know how much blame to carry, Alice replied, and because some truths felt heavier than silence. But now it belongs to all of us. Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible bow. No justice can reverse the past, but honesty is a kind of restoration. He walked to the window, where the light was fading fast across the gardens. And so, he said, we are left not with a murder, but with its ghost, not with a forgery, but a reminder that faith, like memory, can survive the cracks but only if we name them. In the quiet that followed, Eleanor rose from her chair and crossed the room to Alice. She did not speak. She simply stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder. It was enough. Poirot, satisfied at last, took up his hat and gloves. This time, the prayer was finished, not interrupted, not betrayed but spoken aloud, bead by bead, truth by truth, until the string was whole again. Chapter 11. The inheritance of silence. 3 days passed. The weather remained indecisive, as if the skies above Moncrief were still deliberating over judgment. Soft mist clung to the orchard trees in the morning and dissipated slowly as noon arrived. Reluctant to let go, the estate moved cautiously, each corridor and chamber resuming its rhythm, without speaking of what had shattered it. No formal announcement was made about Reverend Lincoln's arrest. None was needed. The quiet said it all. Guests who had stayed beyond the weekend took their leave with polite words and unreadable expressions. Those who remained not for appearances, but for the weight of truth, the kind that binds people not in ceremony, but in shared burden. Poirot delayed his departure, not for lack of resolution, but because a thread still lingered uncut, and he, being who he was, could not abide the idea of unfinished patterns. There was still one door left unopened, one person who had remained conspicuously untouched by the investigation, yet curiously central in its orbit. Lady Beatrice Moncrief. She agreed to see him just after luncheon. In her private sitting room, a chamber lined with shelves of botanical sketches and books on medieval devotional art, a fire crackled gently in the hearth. Above it, a framed illumination showed St. Agnes holding a broken spindle. Her eyes turned not toward heaven, but toward the floor. Beatrice sat in a tall chair near the window, her posture elegant as ever, but her cane resting more heavily against her knee. She did not rise when Poirot entered, but she gestured for him to sit in the chair opposite. You've stayed longer than expected, Monsieur Poirot, she said. I go where the puzzle leads, madam, he replied with a small smile. And sometimes, where the silence insists. She nodded faintly. Silence has always been our currency here. I wonder if we even know how to speak plainly anymore. That is what I have come to ask. Poirot said gently, if you are ready to speak plainly, not for scandal, not for law, but for memory, for the sake of what remains. She looked at him, her pale eyes sharper than her voice. You want to know if I knew the rosary was forged, if I helped craft the lie. I want to know what you chose to carry, madam, and why. Beatrice leaned back, her hands folded over one another, fingers curled but still. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where ivy trembled against the glass. When my husband brought it home, I was young. He told me the Moncrief rosary had been rediscovered in a crumbling monastery in Alsace. He said it had passed through noble hands, that it had survived persecution, fire, and theft. He was radiant, triumphant. He believed it gave the house meaning. Poirot listened silently, hands resting on his knees. But later, she continued, when the papers were examined more closely, when experts like Ashenden began to dig, I saw it unravel. The trail was too clean, too perfect. It had been assembled, not discovered. A fiction dressed in faith. And yet, Poirot said softly, you allowed the illusion to live. Yes, she answered, because by then, it wasn't about a relic. It was about identity. The Moncriefs were no longer landowners, nor governors, nor industrialists. We were keepers of stories. And what happens when the story collapses, Monsieur Poirot? The house falls with it. Poirot nodded slowly. But a story is not sacred unless it is true. Her voice faltered. And what if the truth is too brittle? What if it cannot hold a family together? Poirot leaned forward slightly. Then it is not a family. It is a shrine to what never was. She said nothing for a long moment. The fire hissed in the hearth, a log shifting with a muffled crack. I always thought, she whispered, that if we preserved the relic, the rest could be healed around it. That faith could be manufactured if we held our breath long enough. And instead, Poirot said gently, someone died for it. Beatrice flinched, but not visibly. Only her eyelids fluttered once. I did not ask Paul to kill, she said. But I suspect. I planted the fear that bloomed inside him. He loved this house. He loved its myths. Poirot did not interrupt. She turned her eyes back to him. So yes, I knew. I permitted the lie. But I did not forge it. I only failed to speak. Poirot bowed his head slightly. Then perhaps, madam, the time has come to speak not with guilt, but with grace. To begin again. Not by protecting the story, but by letting others write their own. Beatrice looked away once more. Outside, in the gardens, Alice and Eleanor were walking together slowly, carefully, without words. Something about their pace, neither hurried nor hesitant, suggested a beginning rather than an ending. They deserve the truth, Beatrice said, even if it comes too late to change what's happened. Poirot stood. It never comes too late to change what comes next. She gave him the smallest smile. Do you believe that? Oui, he said. I must. Otherwise, I would be only a man who catches murderers, and not one who restores order. As he made his way to the door, she called after him. Monsieur Poirot, he paused. Thank you for seeing it all, even what I didn't say. He turned, his head in hand, and gave her a slight bow. Merci, madam. But it is not always what is said that reveals the soul. It is what is endured. With that, he departed the room, the door closing softly behind him. And for the first time in a long while, Lady Beatrice Moncrief sat alone, not in silence, but in peace. Outside, the clouds began to break. Not dramatically, there was no sudden burst of sunlight, but the gray lifted just enough for the shapes beneath it to be seen more clearly. The truth, once buried beneath legacy and reverence, had finally been spoken. And though the prayer was not perfect, it was honest. And in the end, honesty was the only inheritance that mattered. Chapter 12. The Circle that Cliseth. Morning of Hercule Poirot's departure was golden with the kind of pale autumn light that made everything look both clearer and sadder. The air had that crispness which hinted at the season's turn, sharp enough to catch in the lungs, soft enough to suggest the world might still be gentle. Moncrief Estate stood quieter than usual, but no longer under the weight of secrecy. It felt, to Poirot, like a house that had just finished weeping. Not empty, but emptied. Cleared of its shadows, at least the worst of them. For all its history, for all its gilded sorrow and elaborate restraint, something fragile had returned to it. Breath. Poirot took his tea alone in the conservatory, his valise packed and waiting near the door. He had asked for no formal farewell. He disliked dramatics when the curtain had already fallen. But as he stirred his tea with practiced precision, he heard footsteps behind him, light, measured, and unmistakably deliberate. He turned before she spoke. It was Alice. She stood at the threshold with her coat draped over one arm, a stack of folded parchment in the other. She did not smile, but her face was open in a way it had not been since he first met her. There was no longer a guardedness in her eyes, only weariness, and beneath it, a clarity that moved him more than any confession could. "You're leaving," she said quietly. "Yes," Poirot replied. "The mystery is resolved. The rest is for others to live through." She stepped forward, offering him the parchment. "I thought you should have these. Ashendon's earliest notes on the rosary, from before Florence. They're yours if you want them." Poirot accepted the pages with a small nod. "Merci, mademoiselle. But they belong to you, I think," she said softly. "They belong to no one anymore. Let them be a record of how even the best minds lose their way." He folded the documents and tucked them neatly into his case. He regarded her for a moment. "Will you stay?" "I might," she said. "Eleanor and I. There's still space between us, but it's no longer hostile. Just unspoken. That's something." Poirot nodded. "It is more than something. It is a beginning." She sat across from him, uninvited but welcome, her gaze moving toward the gardens beyond the glass. The early light gilded the branches, painting shadows across the gravel paths where footsteps had been traced and retraced over the past week. Her voice came after a long pause. "Do you ever wonder if solving it, if unmasking the killer, really changes anything?" Poirot tilted his head slightly. "Change is not always immediate, mademoiselle, nor dramatic. Sometimes it arrives as silence that no longer feels like suffocation, or an apology that no longer curdles. It is a slow miracle." She considered that. Eleanor said something similar yesterday, that she hadn't realized how tightly she'd been gripping a version of herself until it broke. Poirot sipped his tea. "Grief does that. So does truth." They sat in silence for a while longer, not awkwardly, but like two people who understood the value of letting thought settle before speaking. The sunlight continued to crawl across the tile floor, and outside, a bird trilled faintly from the branch of a nearby elm. When Alice stood to leave, she offered her hand. "Thank you," she said, "not just for solving the case, but for not rushing to see what you already believed." Poirot rose as well and gave her hand a gentle, courtly squeeze. "Ah, mademoiselle, it is the greatest mistake of many men to see only what fits the puzzle. But the human heart, it is not a puzzle. It is a labyrinth." She gave a small, grateful laugh. Then she left him alone with his tea, his thoughts, and the soft ticking of time. Later that day, as his hired car pulled away down the winding drive, Poirot turned for a final glance at Moncrief Estate. The great house loomed still and tall against the sky, its stones golden in the sun, its windows glinting like half-lidded eyes. But it no longer felt like a fortress. It felt, finally, like a place where things had been endured rather than concealed. He thought of Lincoln not with contempt, but with the quiet sorrow one reserves for the deeply misled. He thought of Eleanor, tracing her way back to herself through pain. Of Alice, who had lived too long with silence and at last chosen voice. And of Lady Beatrice, whose rule had always seemed absolute, and who had now, at the twilight of her life, discovered the power of relinquishing control. And then there was the rosary. It would remain in its case, whole again, one bead newer than the rest. But that bead would never be hidden. It would shine a little brighter, its color a little off, its surface a little less worn. Not as a mistake, but as memory. A single, imperfect link in the chain, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been found. Poirot sat back in his seat, adjusted his cuffs, and let his eyes fall closed. The case of the teardrop on the prayer beads was over, but the prayer, as all true prayers do, continued beyond the chapel, beyond the house, beyond the grasp of memory itself, not in words, but in the silence that finally told the truth. Chapter 13. What the bead did not say to a weeks later. The wind in London carried a different kind of chill, one not of nature, but of industry. Chimneys smoked like gray beacons above slate rooftops, and the bells of St. Martin in the Fields chimed through the thick air like a memory someone had meant to forget. Hercule Poirot, ever precise, walked with his gloves tucked under one arm and a thin sheaf of notes in the other, his boots clicking over the damp cobblestones of surmise. He was returning from a quiet luncheon with an old colleague at the British Museum. But his thoughts were far from the city's monuments or gossip. They lingered, stubborn and quiet, on the sixth bead. He had not spoken of Moncrief since his return. The newspapers, ever hungry for drama, had been fed the clean version: respected clergyman arrested for murder, motive traced to relic fraud and personal delusion. It was the kind of story that made for a brief column and an even briefer interest. The public had moved on to scandalous disappearances in Bath and a new series of thefts at the docks. But Poirot had not moved on, because the case, though solved, had left something unresolved in him, not a clue, but a sensation. A question not of who had killed, but of what had truly been murdered. Back at his flat, Poirot removed his overcoat, set his notes down, and took to the armchair near the window, where the rain had begun to draw soft lines across the glass. He closed his eyes not to sleep, but to revisit. He saw again the chapel, the kneeling body, the glint of black lacquer under candlelight, the silence of a house that had protected its lies with devotion and its truths with fear. What had begun as a murder over a relic had unfolded into something far stranger. The rosary was merely a symbol. What mattered was the way people had arranged their lives around it. How one object had become the architecture of shame, ambition, and memory. He rose and opened a small drawer in his desk. Inside, carefully sealed in an envelope, was the bead. Not the forensic copy, not the repaired strand Eleanor now kept, but the original, the wax-sealed teardrop that had sparked it all. Scotland Yard had returned it to him, uninterested in its artistic value and unable to prove it held anything more than symbolism. Poirot had kept it, not for evidence, but for understanding. He took it out and held it between his thumb and forefinger. It was lighter than it looked. Smooth, yes, but imperfectly so. The wax along its base was cracked now, revealing the edge of the parchment it had once concealed. The writing had been removed and catalogued, but Poirot could still recall every curve of the Latin inscription. The sixth bead marks the penitent. It was never meant to threaten, nor even to confess. It had been, he now realized, a riddle. Not for him. For Ashenden. Poirot placed the bead on the windowsill, where the light touched it. Then he returned to the armchair and let his mind move backward through Lincom's weary eyes, through Alice's measured hands, through Eleanor's clenched silences, and finally to Beatrice. Not the woman in the chapel, not the widow with quiet resolve, but the girl who had once been told by her husband that a story, when beautiful enough, could become truth. He saw it now as if it had always been there. The sixth bead had not been about guilt. It had been about restoration. Alice, in her silence, had crafted not a lie but a symbol, not a warning, but a bridge. Her action had been bold, yes, but not theatrical. It had invited Ashenden not to suffer, but to see, to reckon with what he had broken in others, to finally name the silence he had benefited from. That it had been intercepted, misread by Lincom was the tragedy. That Ashenden had knelt was the miracle. Poirot exhaled slowly, hands folded in his lap. He understood now that every piece of the Moncrief story, every fragment, every deception had been an act of holding something fragile together. Legacy, yes, but also grief. Grief for what might have been, for what was taken without permission, for what was passed on without questioning. The sixth bead had not been about prayer. It had been about choice. Later that evening, Poirot wrote a letter, not to Scotland Yard, not to the newspapers, But to Alice Gray. Mademoiselle, in our line of work, yours and mine, we come across many objects, artifacts of history, remnants of belief. Some are fakes, some are priceless, and some are neither but still matter. The bead was never a confession. It was a question, and I believe it was one Dr. Ashenden understood just before the end. I wanted you to know your message was not lost. It was simply intercepted. Let that be a comfort, not a weight. And should you ever doubt the truth of what you restored, remember that even a broken strand can hold memory, sometimes more honestly than a perfect one. Yours, in gratitude and in truth, Hercule Poirot sealed it and set it aside for the morning post. Then he returned to the window, where the bead still rested dark and glinting against the gray pane. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, the story had ended, not with a verdict, but with understanding. Chapter 14. Beneath the velvet. 3 days after sending his letter, Poirot received a reply not in the form of stationery or telegram, but in the form of a visitor. He had been preparing for an evening walk along the Thames, brushing the cuffs of his coat and adjusting his scarf with his usual fastidiousness, when the bell at the entrance of his flat rang with a short, unassuming chime. George, ever the discreet valet, opened the door without comment and returned moments later with a faint smile and a name. Miss Alice Gray, monsieur. Poirot turned. Miss Gray, here? She insisted on no appointment, but she carries herself like someone with permission, George replied dryly. Poirot gave a slight nod. Show her in and bring tea. Alice stepped inside quietly. Her presence was the same, controlled, spare, but something in her face had softened. It was not just that she seemed calmer. It was that she no longer seemed to be hiding behind that calm. She wore a navy wool coat buttoned to the collar and carried a small square parcel in both hands, wrapped in brown paper and tied with white string. I hope you don't mind, she said, her voice low. I was in London for work, and I felt I should come. I am always at home to a woman bearing parcels, Poirot replied warmly, gesturing to the armchair across from him, and even more so to one bearing unresolved thoughts. She sat without hesitation and placed the parcel on the table between them. Your letter reached me. I've read it more than once. I wasn't expecting it to affect me so much. Poirot said nothing, allowing silence to be the space where honesty could land. I didn't realize, at the time, that what I did was seen, she continued, or understood. I thought perhaps the message had died with him, that it had failed. It did not fail. Poirot said gently. It was misread, yes, but not by him, and not by me. She looked down at the parcel and slowly untied the string. Beneath the paper was a small wooden box, lacquered in a pale, honeyed tone, clearly handcrafted but unadorned. She opened it to reveal a simple velvet pouch. From it, she withdrew something Poirot had not expected to see again, the replica rosary. Eleanor's, carefully restrung. One bead still slightly mismatched the same teardrop bead that had once rested beneath Ashenden's body. Now cleaned, repaired, and given a new place in the strand. Alice held it lightly in her hands, letting the beads spill over her fingers, their rhythm intact. I've thought about keeping it, she said, but I believe it should go somewhere else, somewhere it can be seen as it is not a relic, not a symbol of penance or devotion, but as a record. Poirot inclined his head. To a museum, perhaps, or a chapel that no longer believes perfection is a requirement for holiness. He smiled at that. You surprise me, mademoiselle. I had you pegged as someone who mistrusted sentiment. I do, she replied, then added, but I don't mistrust honesty. And that's what this has become, honest, not sacred, not grand, just real. They drank tea in silence for a while, the rosary between them like a fragile treaty. Poirot watched her hands as she handled the beads, how gentle they were, how reverent without being religious. He saw in that care not just memory, but forgiveness, perhaps not for Ashenden or Eleanor, or even Beatrice, but for herself. "There's something else," Alice said at last. "Something I didn't say before." "I wasn't sure it mattered." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Everything matters. It is only the order in which it appears that changes our perception of it." "I knew the sixth bead was false the moment I saw it," she said. "But what struck me most wasn't that it had been placed to deceive. It was that it had been made to be found. The wax was never sealed all the way. The mark on the underside, the one Ashenden noted in his research, it was still visible. Anyone curious enough to turn it would have seen the truth." Poirot leaned forward. "So you believe it wasn't planted at him, but for him?" "Yes," she said. "I think someone, possibly Eleanor, possibly even Beatrice, was ready to let the story end. Not destroy it, but open it. Hand it over." Poirot considered this. And Ashenden misread that, too. He thought it was a trap, a warning. "But it was a gift, maybe," Alice said. "Or maybe it was both. A gift he wasn't ready to receive. A grace that felt like shame." Poirot folded his hands, nodding slowly. "It is often the case. Truth, like light, reveals what we would rather keep hidden." Alice looked out the window. "I think the hardest thing is not that the story ended badly. It's that it had a chance to end well, and we missed it." Poirot's voice was soft. "But you did not miss it, mademoiselle. You returned to it. You picked up the thread. And now you restore what others broke." She turned back to him and gave a small smile. "Then perhaps we've closed the circle, finally." "No," Poirot said, shaking his head slightly. "We have not closed it. We have completed it. There's a difference." She placed the rosary back in the box and slid it across the table. "Will you keep it for now?" He looked at the box, then back at her. "With care, until its next chapter is ready." As she rose to leave, Poirot did not stand immediately. He watched her move toward the door with the unhurried grace of someone no longer burdened by silence. At the threshold, she paused. "Do you believe people change, Monsieur Poirot?" "I believe," he said, "that people reveal more of themselves with time. Whether that is change or clarity, I do not always know." She gave him a final, quiet nod. Then she was gone. Poirot stood and walked to the window. The rosary box remained on the table behind him, but he no longer felt the need to examine it. What mattered was not inside it anymore. It was what had been said around it, the conversation, the courage, the confession, the silence that, at long last, had become voice. And beneath the velvet, beneath the wood, the wax, the centuries of artifice and reverence, there was something that had never been forged. The desire to be known, and the willingness, finally, to know. Chapter 15. Shadows cast by lithe autumn days waned, and a chill settled over Moncrief estate, signaling the coming winter that seemed eager to claim even the warmth left in the old stones and gardens. Leaves, once aflame with color, now carpeted the grounds like a last gesture of defiance before the inevitable quiet. Inside the house, life had resumed its careful pace, though it was not quite the same. The air held a residue of conversations once whispered and now no longer avoided. The guests had departed, and only the core of the family and staff remained, each carrying the weight of recent truths in their own way. Poirot, having delayed his own journey back to London by a few days at the family's insistence, found himself wandering the long corridors, visiting rooms that once seemed merely to contain memory, but now felt imbued with it. The chapel, especially, called to him, its silence speaking in tones both mournful and hopeful. He paused at the altar, running his gloved hand lightly over the velvet cushion, now restored and free of the dark stain that had once marred it. There was something in the stillness here that was both a balm and a reminder that even the deepest wounds could fade, but their trace always remained. His thoughts turned to the people he had come to know within these walls, their secrets, their regrets, and their courage. Lady Beatrice, whose steely control had softened into a quiet acceptance, seemed to carry a peace he had not expected from a woman so long burdened by duty and denial. Eleanor, once haunted by loss and shame, was beginning to find herself again, moving through the house with a tentative grace. And Alice Gray, whose presence had been like a whispered question from the past, now stood more firmly, her steps no longer hesitant but purposeful. These were not simply survivors of a crime. They were witnesses to the unmasking of legacy itself. On this particular morning, Poirot found himself invited into the drawing room, where Lady Beatrice awaited, seated by the fire with a letter in her hand. Her eyes, sharp and clear beneath silvered brows, lifted to meet his. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, voice steady but edged with a softness that spoke of relief. "I have just received a letter from the museum curator in Florence. They have agreed to accept the Moncrief rosary into their collection on loan. For a special exhibition on the making and meaning of relics." Poirot allowed himself a smile. "A fitting home for the truth, madam," she nodded. "And they understand the story behind it. The imperfections, the human hands that shaped it, not just the artists, but the lives woven into its history." They sat in companionable silence, the fire casting flickering shadows that danced over the polished wood and faded portraits. Poirot reflected on how the rosary had transformed from a symbol of falsehood and pride to one of reconciliation and memory. "Do you think the family will be at peace now?" he asked gently. Lady Beatrice considered this. "Peace is not a destination, Monsieur Poirot. It is a journey we take daily, with the knowledge of what we have lost and what we can still become." Poirot nodded in agreement. "Wise words, madam, and you have done more than most to guide that journey." The room grew quiet again, filled only by the crackling fire and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. Outside, the gardens were beginning to frost, the first kiss of winter settling like a promise. Before he left, Poirot was invited to the chapel once more, this time to meet Eleanor and Alice together. The two women stood side by side, holding the repaired rosary between them, no longer a relic of silence, but a testament to their shared resilience. They spoke softly of the future, of mending what had been broken, not just in wood and wax, but in hearts and histories. Poirot listened and smiled, knowing that the final prayer was not one spoken aloud, but one lived in quiet courage. The story of the teardrop on the prayer beads was no longer just a tale of murder and mystery, but a reflection on the power of truth and forgiveness, and the fragile beauty of human connection. That is the sunset behind the rolling hills, casting long shadows that stretched toward the horizon. Poirot took his leave. He stepped out onto the gravel path, the evening air crisp and clear, and looked back once more at the house that had held so many secrets. The rosary's beads might have been scattered and stained, its story fraught with pain and deception, but the thread of honesty that now bound it was stronger than any lie. And in that thread, Poirot saw the promise of light piercing even the darkest shadow. With a final nod to the estate, Hercule Poirot turned toward the road that would lead him home, carrying with him the quiet grace of a mystery resolved not just with logic, but with heart. The carriage rolled steadily through the awakening countryside, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels over worn stones, a steady heartbeat beneath the misty dawn. The landscape, brushed in muted greens and grays, slipped past the window as Hercule Poirot sat quietly, fingers gently interlaced, his sharp eyes reflecting the gentle light filtering through the low clouds. Beside him, Hastings leaned back with a sigh, the weight of the past days settling upon him like the lingering chill of the morning air. For a long moment neither spoke. Outside, the trees whispered softly in the breeze, as if exchanging secrets with the sky. The manor of Finchley, once a fortress of pride and silence, receded into the distance, its ivy-clad walls and darkened windows no longer a place of shadows, but a monument to truth revealed. Finally, Hastings broke the silence. "Poirot, I keep thinking about Lady Eugenia." For all her faults, and there were many, I think she truly believed she was protecting something greater. Do you think that excuses her? Poirot's lips curled in a subtle smile, thoughtful and measured. Mon ami, excuse and understanding are different things. Lady Eugenia acted out of loyalty, fear, and an unyielding devotion to legacy. Such motivations can twist the noblest of intentions into acts of tragedy. She is no villain in the simple sense. Rather, she is a tragic figure guardian who lost her way in the labyrinth of silence she helped build. Hastings nodded slowly. And the others? The Viscountess, Dr. Finch, Henry Haskett, even Clara, in her own way? They are all threads woven into the same tapestry, Poirot said softly. Viscountess Breton ambitious, yes, and perhaps reckless in her desire to control the narrative, was not the architect of the crime, but an unwitting accomplice to the unfolding drama. Dr. Finch, burdened by the ghosts of his father's choices, held secrets not his own, caught in a web of inherited silence. Henry Haskett's journey was one of seeking answers, attempting to mend a family fractured by shame. And Clara, she represents hope, the voice that dared to break the long-held quiet, to confront the past with courage. She is the light piercing the gloom. Poirot's eyes glimmered with warmth as he regarded Hastings. The little gray cells did more than solve a murder. They uncovered the human frailty beneath the stone and varnish of Finchley. It is a reminder that the most dangerous crimes are not always those that stain the hands with blood, but those that bind the heart with silence. Hastings smiled wryly. So the portrait that blinked wasn't a ghost at all. It was the past watching us, waiting for someone brave enough to see. Precisely, Poirot agreed. The portrait's eyes are not windows into the supernatural, but mirrors reflecting our own fears and guilt. They compel us to look inward, to face what we might prefer to hide. The story of Finchley teaches us that secrets are never truly hidden. They only wait for the right moment to reveal themselves. Sometimes in the most unexpected ways. They fell into silence again. The carriage moving steadily toward London. The familiar spires and rooftops emerging through the mist. Poirot turned to Hastings, his expression lighter now. And what of you, mon ami? What have you learned from this tale? Hastings chuckled softly. That even the grandest estates hold the most fragile hearts. That courage comes in many forms, and sometimes it's the smallest voice that changes everything. Poirot smiled, tapping his fingers lightly. A wise observation. And that, perhaps, is the greatest mystery of all, the mystery of human nature, which never ceases to surprise. As they neared the city, the rain began anew, gentle and cleansing, washing away the grime of the road and, symbolically, the stains of Finchley's past. Poirot adjusted his head against the drizzle and looked forward, his mind already turning to the cases yet to come. The carriage slowed at the familiar door of 221B Baker Street. Hastings gathered his belongings while Poirot remained seated a moment longer, savoring the quiet aftermath of justice served and truths uncovered. As the driver opened the door, Poirot rose with his characteristic grace. Come, Hastings. The world will always offer mysteries, but it is our duty to bring light, no matter how faint, to those shadows. Hastings followed, smiling. And I'm glad to have you by my side. The door shut softly behind them, leaving the rain to fall uninterrupted on the cobbled streets. Finchley House, with its silent portrait and heavy history, faded into memory, an enduring testament to the power of truth, the perils of silence, and the enduring wisdom of Hercule Poirot's little gray cells.